Hey, what's up? This is Jake, and today's video is going to go over the path I would recommend for people looking to either start a career in IT as a young person or to switch careers into IT from somewhere else. I am a career switcher. This is advice that I would have given myself 5 years, 6 years ago, and I did this exact path. I did it in a little bit different order, and if I had to do it all over again, I would do things a little differently. So I'm going to show you exactly how I would do it if I did it again today, knowing now what I know. And I was able to quadruple my salary in 5 years following this path. So if you're looking to get into IT and you want to get out of the norm and break out of that shell into something much more lucrative and much more satisfying, this is definitely a good video for you to watch. This may not work for everybody, but I would say, based on my peer group and things we talk about, this is far better advice than you're going to find at a school or a career counselor or talking to HR or idiots on Reddit. So here you go. So the first thing you need to do, don't go get certifications. Don't go do a whole bunch of A plus and Network plus and Security plus. Just pick a cloud and learn that cloud. There's several different major cloud providers out there. You can do AWS, you can do GCP or Azure, would be the big three I would recommend. And just pick one and go with it and get really good at it. Anything you're going to learn from that point forward, you need to be doing in that cloud. So whatever it is that you're wanting to learn about IT, you should be doing it in the cloud. If you go on LinkedIn and look at job postings, they're all hosted in a cloud of some kind. So whatever you're going to learn, if you're not learning it in the cloud, you're eliminating a huge number of jobs or job prospects that you could be considered for. And that's not what you want to do to make yourself marketable, and it's not the skills you want to make you relevant. So I recommend AWS because the free tier that you get when you first create an account, I think is the best free tier that's out there. Everybody offers some form of free tier for you to just try things out, but I think Amazon's free tier offering is superior to the others. I won't say that it's the superior cloud because there's definitely use cases where the other ones might make more sense. But I also think Amazon is the best place to learn because the majority of people operating in the cloud today are using Amazon. So if you're just straight up looking to switch careers, if you learn AWS, you're going to have a larger number of job postings that you can apply for. So due to the law of large numbers, it's more in your benefit to learn on a cloud provider that has more to offer you, and you can always switch later. There's even courses you can take on like learning Google Cloud platform for people who know AWS. So there's there's like all kinds of stuff out there. But that's step number one, learn the cloud. Step number two, learn Git and branching. So what does that mean? GitLab, GitHub, whatever you want to use. I use GitHub. Um, Learn how to use that, because as you start writing scripts or templates or just notes, learning how to do that in Git is very, very useful because everybody uses some sort of version control for their code, and it's all some form of Git, whether that's Bitbucket, GitLab, GitHub, whatever. They're using something. And you should know how to use that. And if you store all of your files there instead of like in OneNote or a composition notebook, if you're old school, or Google Doc or something like that, you're just doing yourself another disservice. So if you're already going to be documenting things to save, to remember, do it and I would just, use GitHub, and I think you're going to be very happy, or GitLab, you're going to be very happy that you did, because that is a job function you'll be using every day. And so learning it from the beginning is as a way to store documents is a really good start. Through that, you're going to be learning, because of the way you store things, something called Markdown. You'll be creating Markdown files instead of like docx files or Excel files or whatever. And that has its own syntax, and you're going to have to learn how to. It's similar to HTML, but not nearly as complicated. Not that HTML is complicated, but for people who don't code, maybe that's complicated for you. But learning how to take notes in Markdown and how to create image references, links, embedded links in images and things like that. It's very useful, and it's just a good starting place for you once you're starting to get familiar with the cloud and needing to take notes. Since you're learning Git, you'll also need to look up something called branching strategies. So just go on YouTube and maybe just watch like 4 or 5 videos on branching strategies and learn what that is. Any video that uses like a highway or freeway merging kind of analogy will probably be really useful. I'm not going to teach all of this stuff. I'm just showing you the path. Because you can save, right, or push all of your changes to Git to store them, or you can learn how to do like a feature branch or some kind of branch where you save all your stuff to a branch, and then when you want to put it in your actual Git repository, you can learn how to merge that branch in. And learning how to do all that at the basic level will really help you have that conversation, whether that's becoming a developer where you use this stuff all the time, or if you're more on the operations side of things, managing servers, infrastructure, networks, stuff like that, and just understanding how to communicate with developers, or how to look at like, oh, this change was pushed to production and it broke everything. Like, what happened? Knowing how to have that conversation and do the investigation for root cause analysis is extremely important. So it's something I didn't learn until later, and I wish that branching strategies is something I would have learned earlier. So that I would recommend, while learning Git, to also just take a look at branching strategies. The next thing I would do is, once you're familiar with, a little bit of moving around in the cloud and the user interface through your web browser, and storing all of your documentation in Git, is Linux and networking. This is a little bit more of a long pole in the tent, because you can't just go take a course on Linux and be like, okay, I know Linux now. Like, it's something you have to pursue if long term. You should know how to SSH with a key into Linux. You should know how how the different folder structure in the tree is laid out in the operating system, or what on earth is a tree, what is a folder, what is a directory, what is a file, what are some basic Linux commands, how do you troubleshoot Linux server, how do you, check the memory? How do you check the CPU? How do you know how many cores or CPU, how much CPU it has? How much, how much memory it has? How do you see if the disks are full? Things like that. Those are very commonly used things that everybody should know, regardless of whatever it is you do in IT. And the other part of that's networking. The big part of that I would focus on, because networking is a huge conversation, is really just understanding how TCP/IP and subnet masking works. If you understand the basics of binary, and you understand TCP/IP and maybe the OSI model, and understanding the different layers and what happens at those layers, will really help when you're trying to troubleshoot things or design things, or just reading documentation. Sometimes documentation just has this assumption of prior knowledge that you're like, well, what is he talking about? Where would I have learned that? Well, I would throw that in now. So basic Linux administration, and I would throw in some bash shell scripting in there with your networking. So you're going to see bash scripts in the form of something called user data in AWS if you're learning in the cloud there, and understanding what that is, and all that, and even maybe something called regular expression would be useful, even though I have to Google it all the time because I'm horrible at regular expression, or regex as we call it. So yeah, Linux and networking is the next thing I would learn. Don't pay for courses unless it's something on Udemy that's on sale and very cheap. Udemy is a source I use a lot, and their sales like pretty much once a week, where an $80-$90 course will be like $18. Linux Academy, a lot of people use that, or A Cloud Guru. It's like $40 a month. Again, you can don't go to Barnes and Noble and buy an $80 book. Like you just go online, watch YouTube, subscribe to some good YouTube channels, or just look for free resources and just build stuff. The biggest thing, it's not reading, it's just build stuff and break it and try to fix it. And you learn a lot more from that. So get as hands-on as you can with Linux and with networking. The next thing is YAML and JSON. Now this is kind of like people that I work with or my friends would probably laugh that I even mentioned this, but everything is written in YAML and JSON. I mean, not everything, but like a lot of things. So if you understand how to write a YAML file, which is really just a template, right? It's just like, think about like a formatted Word document that has like, oh, there's supposed to be two spaces and then a hyphen and then another space and then you can type something. Like all these little tiny rules, there's not many of them, but if you know what a YAML file looks like and you know how to write it, um, that's something, again, it's assumed prior knowledge. Same with JSON, um, which if you're curious, I mean, you can Google all this stuff, but like yet another markup language and JavaScript object notation is, but you don't really need to know that. If you're curious, that's what it is. But it's just a document. It's just an object written as a document that has a very specific way of typing, like with brackets or with hyphens or whatever, that you can feed to something in the cloud or to some other piece of software, so it can read it. And that's really it. And it has to be formatted correctly. So those are two things that, I mean, you can kind of touch on, like, what's YAML, what's JSON, what does that look like? As you start learning some of these tools, you'll kind of just pick it up. So I wouldn't like go take a course on like, well, how to learn YAML, because it's kind of a waste of time. Just know that those are two things you should be familiar with enough to be comfortable talking about them or writing them. The next thing is infrastructure as code, or also known as IAC. So as you get familiar with the cloud and building servers and logging into them and doing your Linux administration, learning how to do patches or kernel upgrades or whatever it is you're doing, and troubleshooting networks or designing network topologies, like simple ones, like how to get two servers to connect to each other, and how to do, access control lists and things like that. You're going to want to stop building all this stuff by hand because it takes forever. And this is where, once you've gone through the process of struggling through building it by hand and you're starting to understand it, and you've done repetition after repetition and it's becoming second nature, at that point, it's like, okay, well, now you're not really learning anymore. You're just wasting your time every time you have to build a server. So if I'm going to do a lab and just like build something for a day, I'm not going to go through 15 minutes of, provisioning a server just to, you know, get to the point where I want to practice the thing I actually want to practice. I'm going to use something called infrastructure as code, and I'll just go over two things you can use with AWS. You can use CloudFormation, which is the native infrastructure as code tool with AWS, or you can use Terraform. You should learn both, and my recommendation is to learn CloudFormation. It's just, yeah, you can do it all in YAML or JSON, whatever you like, and it's a bit simpler of a concept to grasp at first, and there's plenty of great documentation on it, AWS documentation. And you can just write a file and save it, and when you want to build something, you just go, hey, go build yourself, and it'll just build all this stuff for you, which is kind of cool, right? And that's a declarative infrastructure where you say in the file or declare everything you want it to build, and then you give AWS that file, and then it just goes and builds everything. And that'll save you your time. And also, when you're cleaning your labs up, it's kind of nice because you can just tear it all down instead of having to go, did I delete this load balancer? Like, I have to remember everything. And then you're saving money because you're not getting billed for it. Much faster. And then after you get comfortable with CloudFormation, you struggled through that for a little bit, then I would learn Terraform. And only because, not because I think it's a superior tool. I do think it's pretty cool, but like, um, that's something you're going to see in job interviews. And if you don't work somewhere that uses Terraform, they've probably considered Terraform. Um, but the vast majority of people I see on the internet posting jobs list, hey, you should know CloudFormation or Terraform or a bunch of other stuff that I'll talk about later. So it's definitely something you should be familiar with and understand how to do initializations and builds and all this other stuff and destroy and just have experience, building the same thing you built with CloudFormation, but build it with Terraform. So that's definitely something you should look at. It's pretty much the gold standard now, is that like all of your infrastructure should be done as code. The next thing is monitoring. So once you have all this stuff built, you're going to want to be able to look at monitoring and say, hey, is this thing running? Is it up? Is it down? Is it fast? Is it slow? It's like, what's going on? Are people using it? Is nobody using it? AWS has this stuff built in with a tool called CloudWatch, and you can do a lot with that, but not everybody uses AWS. Most people use third-party monitoring tools. Not everybody uses AWS CloudWatch for monitoring. Most people use third-party monitoring tools, things like Prometheus or Grafana or Zabbix or stuff like that. And so you're going to want to pick a monitoring tool, and you can just look up like a great thing to Google would be like DevOps, best DevOps monitoring tools, and just pick one. Like if you want to pick an easy one, like pick Zabbix or do Prometheus or something like that, and just try something out and see if you like it. Everybody's got their opinions on this, but that's the next thing you learn, because once you build stuff, you need to be able to monitor it to get the status of what's going on with your infrastructure. So that's the next thing I would learn, and that would include monitoring. It's not a hardware thing, but like monitoring disk space, monitoring CPU utilization, monitoring memory, monitoring processes, monitoring jobs, monitoring SQL queries on databases, like all this other stuff. Um, so just going through a monitoring tool and getting good at that. The next thing is data structures. So as you get through a lot of this infrastructure stuff, and we're talking about declarative infrastructure using things like JSON and YAML files, and then you start monitoring it, it's like, okay, well, now we need to get to the part where you're starting to get over to more of the development side and learning a programming language. And what I would do first is I would learn what a data structure is and how data structures work to better understand the terminology when learning a programming language. Because I think it's good to learn, if you're going to learn something called an object-oriented programming language, you should understand how object orientation works and understand like what is a dictionary, what is a library, what is a list, what is an array, what is an object, like just all that kind of stuff. And so just going on YouTube and again watch 4 or 5 videos on data structures and just get the idea of like what is a big piece, and then like all the little pieces that make up the big piece, and what are those things called, and how are they used. And then I think learning a programming language might make a little bit more sense. And you're going to learn data structures with a programming language, so you're going to be kind of learning these two things at the same time, which brings me to programming languages. Um, I recommend learning whatever programming language you like. There's no best programming language. There's only whatever programming languages employers use at their company. So, unfortunately, some of them use outdated programming languages that are kind of not really seen as like the hip new thing, like PHP, for example. I still see a lot of PHP all over the place, but it's not one I would recommend. But you'll run into it. But again, if you understand data structures, you'll probably be able to figure that out so long as you understand one programming language. If I had to pick one for somebody to learn as a newcomer, it would definitely be Python. If I had to pick another language, if you really hated Python for some reason and you were really into like the website, or you really just kind of wanted to learn something else, if my second pick would be JavaScript. Either of those will probably serve you well, but I think Python is a little more prevalent in the DevOps community. And so if you're looking at doing something with infrastructure, I think learning Python will probably be your best bet. It's very accessible, easy to understand, easy to learn language, very human readable. Um, not as many curly brackets and things like that as the Java-based languages. But it also has a lot of documentation online. It's been around for a really long time, and any of the tools that you're going to be learning in AWS are going to that require code or that have the option to use code will have Python as an option. So that's a good one to learn. But definitely you need to know a scripting language. Okay, that's going to come up everywhere. So you understand infrastructure, including the network and the administration of servers in the cloud and data structures and programming to manipulate them, and you know how to template it all with infrastructure as code. So the next thing I would do is I would look into containers. And this is where you take these concepts you learned, and then you're just kind of abstract that a little bit with some layers. And this is where understanding, like I talked about the OSI model, understanding where a container starts and begins, and where the operating system starts and begins, understanding what a hypervisor is and how all that works. And then because you're going to thank me that you spent some time learning networking before you get into containers, because there's port mapping that needs to happen, and forwarding, things like that, that will make a lot more sense if you have a basic networking knowledge once you get into containers. Containers specifically, just stick with Docker for now. That's all you're really going to do. There's a whole bunch of other stuff going on in the industry right now that with Docker that I won't get into that. But if you just learn Docker, and you should be fine. And then as you progress through that and you get more familiar with that, and you start replacing some of the things you were building in the cloud that you were building instances on or servers, and you can start building it with containers instead. And the next step would be orchestration and config management. So orchestration can be, I would use it in the, you can do it with instances, but really the orchestration I'm talking about is Kubernetes. And that's where you get into managing multiple containers. Um, I mean, multiple, like hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of containers. And you're going to do the most right by yourself by learning Kubernetes to manage them. And if you're using instances or you're using something else to manage containers, the 3, 4 I would recommend would be Chef, Puppet, Ansible, and SaltStack. So um, there's pros and cons to all of them. Pick one. Um, I have the most experience with Ansible, and I really, really like Ansible. It's definitely a really great tool. There are reasons why I think for marketing yourself for jobs that you might want to pick one over the other. And I would probably go with Chef or Puppet because it seems like that's more in the market. However, it doesn't matter, I don't think, because really what it comes down to in an interview to get a job is, hey, do you know like Terraform, Ansible, Chef, Puppet, etc.? And you can be like, oh yeah, I know Ansible, or oh yeah, I know Chef, or whatever. And as long as you know one of them, you can learn the other ones. That's every interview I've ever been in. That's pretty much the message that's given to me. Um, in some cases, they do want somebody who's really, really good with that particular tool. So maybe play with all of them. But as far as learning goes, just pick one and go with that and be like, yeah, I know Ansible, or I know Puppet, or Chef, or whatever you're going to use. But I would just stick with those three: Ansible, Chef, or Puppet for config management, and stick with Kubernetes for orchestration. How do you learn that? Again, Google is your friend. Watch lots of YouTube videos. There's books out there you can get if you're a reader, but as long as the book is a hands-on book and has a lot of like doing labs and building things, that's what you want. None of this is something you can read and understand. It's all things you need to build and get hands-on experience with. So the next thing I would do is just brush up on your terminology. So after you've learned all this stuff, go through some job posts, like a couple dozen job posts, and just look at all the acronyms, look at all the job requirements, and go, is there anything on here I don't know? After going through all of the stuff I just mentioned, you'll probably be familiar with all of it, but you may come across some things you're not familiar with. And I would just go through and just, again, 4 or 5 YouTube videos per thing you don't know, and just learn whatever it is they're talking about and be like, oh yeah, that's like Puppet, or oh yeah, I get this. This is kind of like this other thing, or maybe it's new and you never heard of it before. But you just want to make sure you can speak to all this stuff because these acronyms and things are pretty universal. They're globally used, so you should be familiar with anything that's on a job posting before you even think about applying for it. So half of this is terminology. If you're confident and you can speak the language, you can get through a lot of interviews and fool a lot of people. Unfortunately, that can be a really bad thing because we have a huge problem with people that look great on paper and they say all the right things, and then you hand them something and they have no idea what to do with it. So don't be one of those people. It's a gap filler, right? We want to look at terminology as a gap filler, is that whatever you learned up to this point, going through infrastructure and Linux and networking and infrastructure as code and all that stuff, like just make sure at the end of it, like you fill the gaps. That's really the most important part. So once you get to that point, and this is kind of something you can do along the way, I probably wouldn't start doing this podcast, blogs, and meetups. I wouldn't start doing this right out the gate, only because it might confuse you more than anything, because they're going to be, especially that terminology part, like they're going to be using all kinds of acronyms and talking about software and having all these opinions, and you don't really want to form those opinions until you've had a chance to work through some things. But they're very helpful. So at some point during this, definitely just go through podcasts and just search like DevOps or infrastructure or cloud or development or programming or whatever, Python or Kubernetes or Terraform, or just like any of the, Ansible, any of the things that you are working on. Just look for podcasts, look for blogs, subscribe to them, and then check out meetups. So there's a meetups app I use to go find, like I did a web development meetup. I'm not a web developer, and just go learn something, go meet people, network, find out what people are working on, and volunteer to work on projects. And don't charge people; just do it because it's a community thing, which gets me into like an open source thing, which I'll get to at the end. Um, once you get experience building things, you'll start to form opinions about things, and you read through a lot of documentation. Then you can get to the design phase, and that's where, well, after you learn all this, if somebody, if you think of a hypothetical situation where somebody or a customer or your employer came to you and said, "Hey, we want you to build this," um, at that point, you should have enough of an opinion to be like, "Oh, okay, well, you could solve that problem by building this, and actually design some sort of solution or architect something, some sort of solution that would solve that problem, or maybe redesign something that's old that needs to be upgraded and made simpler or made more agile or made more highly available or durable or whatever." And so that's a big part of it. There's a lot of connective tissue in here with design, with something called pipelines that I did not put in here, unless you're truly interested in DevOps. But I do think everybody should have a functional familiarity with pipelines. But that'll be part of your design. I'm not going to go over it specifically, but I'll just throw it in there. Go ahead and look at some stuff about pipelines, things like Jenkins. Um, and then also some tools like Maven, Gradle, and then like any of the what's something we call CI/CD, continuous integration, and either continuous deployment or continuous delivery. Again, 4 or 5 YouTube videos, learn about CI/CD pipelines. Maybe spend some time learning Jenkins as a starter, and go from there. And then just be able to design a pipeline, be able to design an architecture, and learn how to make tests to see if your code is good, and automate all of that so that it provisions things on the fly for you and heals itself, and you can monitor it. And if you've done all these things at this point, you basically build a whole company. So then at that point, speaking of building whole companies, when you start building these things, put them in a portfolio. This is where you have Git, right? So if you've been documenting everything along the way, you should have several repositories with different projects that you've been working on, and you can start building up a portfolio. Be like, hey, here's this Jenkins thing that I built, and I built a pipeline. Or hey, I have a whole bunch of CloudFormation templates that I built to provision, like a web server. Or here's one where I did highly available, serverless web application, or here's one I did with a bunch of Lambda functions that does video transcoding, or just like whatever thing. Basically, just solve problems. Just find problems that are out there and try to solve them, and keep all that stuff in your GitHub or your GitLab account, and have that as a portfolio. If you're not quite sure where to start, go with open source projects. You don't have to contribute to them, but open source projects are going to be out there on GitHub, and you can just go to a Git page for a piece of open source software, and there's all kinds of tickets and bugs and all kinds of that, and you can just like pick one and start learning it and go. And I guarantee you, when you first start, you probably have no idea what anybody's talking about or how to contribute, but just follow along and just try to be part of the process, and just read what people are posting and try to learn from it, ask questions. People can be pretty ruthless on open source projects, so it's not a great place to go paste a bunch of code and be like, I have this problem, what's going on? And like, sometimes people can be pretty rude on them, but just a heads up, but definitely worth looking into. So that's pretty much it. At that point, I think if you were looking to get into IT, or as a career switcher, if you knew all of these things, even just at the basic level, you would definitely be in a much better position than if you had gone to school for 3 years or 4 years or 7 years, or master's, bachelor's degree, or whatever. And you can do all this for free if you wanted to. I would probably pay for a couple Udemy courses or books or whatever along the way, but you could do every single one of these things for less than $100. And you can do them as fast or slow as you want. So it might take some people 2 years to do all this. It might take some people 2 months to do all of this, but it's it's never done, right? So every single one of these topics that I went over today is something that I continuously learn every day. I'm relearning something or learning something new about it, or trying different combinations of things where maybe you used Terraform to deploy something, um, where you're using GitHub, and you built a pipeline with Jenkins, and it pushed via Terraform to, or CloudFormation, for example, to AWS. And you're like, I'm gonna build the exact same thing, but instead of CloudFormation, we use Terraform. Instead of AWS, I'm gonna put it in GCP. Switch it up, try different things. I monitored it with Prometheus. Now I'm going to monitor it with Zabbix. I monitored it with Zabbix. Now I'm going to monitor it with, this other thing. And you can just switch it up, and just try rebuilding the same stuff with different products, and save all your templates, save all your code, put it in your repos. And if somebody down the road at your company ever says, hey, we're looking to do this, do you know anything about it? You can be like, yeah, I can check it out, and go into your repo and be like, I solved this problem a long time ago. Um, and you can just recycle all this code. You can recycle all these ideas. You can recycle so much stuff. Like, you rarely should ever start with a blank document for anything. So if nothing else, at the end of this, you're going to have a lot of resources for yourself to refer back to. And yeah, that's it. So that is what I would do if I were starting this today. And hopefully that helps for people looking to do stuff. Notice I didn't mention anything about certifications. There are certifications for Kubernetes and Terraform and AWS. And if you want to get those, great. Go ahead and go get those. If I had to make a recommendation, I'd probably go get the AWS Certified Cloud Practitioner one, just to kind of validate that you have basic cloud skills. But it's really not necessary. If you find you're having a hard time getting interviews because you don't have a degree, then I think certifications might help you. So maybe go get those at that point. But try it without getting them and see if you can get interviews. If you have questions, let me know. And comments are always welcome. So feel free to leave feedback. And I guess I'll just talk to you guys in the next one. I will make another video. The next one's going to be how to go through LinkedIn and figure out what on earth it is that people want, and how I came to get this list. So stay tuned.